250,000 people live here on the banks of the Genesee River in northwestern New York, the city of Rochester, on a cold day, an ordinary day in the early spring. At the Kodak building, the offices are beginning to empty. In front of McCurdy's, the crosswalk is crowded and busy. On Main Street, women wait for their husbands. At the corner, kids get on a bus. Some people head for Sibley's. Most, after a long day, head for home. 250,000, 250,000 call Rochester their home. And if by some dark fantasy, the epidemic in this nation traveled from city to city, 10 years from now, every man, woman, and child in this city will be dead. The city is empty. The buildings remain. The people are dead. 250,000 men, women, children, babies just born, all races, every religion. The killer is blind. Of course, the people of this city aren't really dead. Rochester is just a symbol. Its population, 250,000, equal to the number of Americans slaughtered every decade by the most violent killer in recent history. You and I, those of us who drive while intoxicated. The crime is called DWI. It's the single greatest cause of violence in America, the drunk driver behind the wheel of a car. In battle, for example, in all the wars in 200 years of American history, we've lost almost 700,000 men and women. But in just the last 4 decades, 2.5 times that many, almost 2 million Americans have died on our roads and highways, half of them because of a bottle. Nothing kills or maims more often. Not handguns or plane crashes or drownings or war or any other single cause. And in this yearly slaughter, this next story is sad and typical.
I had to go pick his bike up. At that time, the police in charge told me that there wasn't much hope. They weren't real sure that it was my boy, but they were pretty sure. I think one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do was go to Seattle and identify my boy. And the second thing was to come home and tell my wife. And that was my day.
The day was August 19th, 1981, in Seattle, Washington. 3 boys were playing in the brush alongside a 2-lane road. Coming around a curve at 60 or 70 miles per hour, 19-year-old Dorothy Judge, drunk, blood alcohol level .17. She lost control of her car, hit the 3 boys, and skidded to a stop 160 feet later. The 3 children were killed. One of them was 7-year-old Billy Holt, raised since he was 6 months old by his grandparents, Myrna and David Craig.
The only thing I could think of is why wasn't it me instead of him? Because if I'd had the opportunity and if my wife had had the opportunity, we would have stepped in front of that car.
10-year-old Aaron Fox also died that afternoon.
There are still times late at night or certain incidences that I think about him and that it will upset me to think about him, but like I said, most of the time I think on the positive things and the good memories that I have.
Tim Brizendine was also killed that day. You've met his father. Tim was his youngest child.
There's just no way you can really describe the loss of somebody that's that close. There's not a day that goes by that we don't think of it. I don't think you fully ever recover from it.
Dorothy Judge was convicted on 3 counts of negligent homicide and sentenced to 10 years in prison on each count to be served concurrently. While in prison, she granted one and only one interview to King Television in Seattle.
I have and always have been sorry, so sorry that this has happened. And I want to make it up.
Of her 10-year sentence, Dorothy Judge served 2 years and 2 months before she was paroled. And despite her public apology on television to at least one mother, it wasn't enough.
She never told me she was sorry. It's like when she was trying to get out on parole, her mother called me. It's the first contact we'd had with anybody in her family, and asked me if it would be all right if Dorothy wrote me a letter and told me, you know, how she felt and so forth. And I told her that's all I ever really wanted from her, was just an apology, more or less, you know, some kind of remorse. Of course, then she got on parole, so I never got my letter.
Today, the 3 boys are dead and buried and forgotten except by their families. And that's part of the problem. There's no time to grieve. 21 minutes after the children died, someone else was killed by a drunk driver in this nation, and 1 American has died every 21 minutes since. Still, it is one of the most perplexing and misunderstood crimes in America, drinking and driving. The cost each year in dollars and lives and grief is almost unimaginable. And yet most of us don't take it very seriously. We think instead, as long as we're careful, we won't get caught, we won't get hurt, we won't hurt anyone else. We don't see it as a crime. We don't see ourselves as criminals. Well, there are some people we're about to meet who would like to change our minds. They're part of a growing and angry movement in the United States, trying to change our laws and our attitudes, and what they believe is, unfortunately, based upon personal experience. I'll be right back. In most of our lives, our daily routine, there is nothing that we touch that has as much speed or power or explosive force. It's a kind of weapon, a 3,000 to 4,000 pound missile powered by 20 gallons of high explosive and made of heavy iron and steel, sharp plastic and glass that shatter and crush upon impact. In the middle of it all, of course, sits a human body, tender and fragile by comparison, made of flesh, easily cut, crushed, and broken. The slow motion is deceiving. If you hit a tree or a retaining wall at 55 miles per hour without seatbelts, you'll die in 7/10 of a second. A car is a kind of double identity. Most days it is reliable transportation, but every day it is a potential weapon.
People don't understand how horrible it is. They don't understand what happens when one car hits another car or one truck hits another car. It was just like a high explosive shell had gone off right on the dashboard in front of us, you know. If you had taken a direct hit from a big round of artillery, it wouldn't have been any worse.
Robert Bell didn't make it home that night, July 19th, 1984, in Miami, Florida, the night his wife and daughter died. His yellow Toyota was hit almost head-on by 33-year-old David McManus, driving a blue pickup truck.
The fellow who hit us climbed out of his truck, and he came around, stuck his head in the car on my side, and he said, "Is anyone alive?" And I said, "Yes, we need help." And that's when he took off. He fled the scene of the accident. He said something like, "Well, we wouldn't live long, or not to worry about it because we wouldn't live long," and said, then I began to despair that anyone was going to help us.
McManus ran across the road, dove into a nearby canal, and later was found by the police hiding in some bushes. On February 20th, 1985, 8 months after the accident, he was convicted on 2 counts of manslaughter, driving while intoxicated, and leaving the scene of an accident with injuries. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Robert Bell's wife, Rosalie, died in the accident that night. She was a psychiatric social worker, the mother of a 2.5-year-old child, their only child, Elizabeth, who survived for an hour and then died at North Miami General Hospital. That leaves Robert Bell, who spent a month in the hospital recovering from various cuts and bruises and broken bones, and began every one of those days with the questions survivors always ask of themselves.
At first, I wondered why me, you know, why did I survive? And because I was trying to save them. That was my major objective at the time, was to try to save them. I wasn't able to do it. You know, I was basically helpless. I wasn't able to do anything. But I was trying to turn the car to get the impact away from them.
From husband and father to single and alone, all in just 1 hour of one night. At home, he keeps his daughter's playthings just as they were. He won't move them or throw them away. It seems he's not ready yet. And he keeps a cassette tape made one night of his wife trying to teach their daughter new letters and words.
Can you say ball?
Ball.
Can you say swing?
Swing.
Can you say chair?
Chair.
Good. Can you say bear?
Bear.
Yeah. Can you?
The tape is painful, but keeping it's not hard to understand. The man misses his family.
My wife had at least another 35 or 40 years of life ahead of her, and my daughter had maybe 70 or 75 years of life ahead of her, at least. So, you know, you think about the tremendous loss, but also the fact that you just simply miss them and that you never see them again. They never come back.
Of course, in a way, he's wrong. She didn't have another 35 or 40 years, and Elizabeth didn't have another 70 years in front of her. It's the mistake we all make. You can't presume life because you can't predict death. Drunk drivers can kill at any time. They are random and unpredictable. You don't know where they are or when they're coming or how many are out there. The National Safety Council says 1 in 10 on a weekend night. And he or she might be in the car next to you, or behind you, or somewhere in front of you out of sight, about to run a red light, or come around a curve in your lane out of control. There's no way to know. And sometimes it doesn't matter how much care you take. Robert Bell took a side road that night because he thought it was safer than the freeway. He hadn't been drinking. He was driving the speed limit. He and his wife were wearing seat belts. His daughter was buckled into a child's safety seat. He did everything he could. It didn't matter. His family was killed or murdered, depending on your view. Candy Lightner is the founder of MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, an organization she began in 1980 after her daughter was killed.
Someone said to me once, well now, Candy, let's look at this very realistically. I mean, how can you possibly compare killing with a car to someone deliberately getting a gun or a knife and murdering? And I said, what you have here to me is almost worse, because you're talking about random killing. It's like somebody getting up on a tower with a gun and shooting at people randomly and not knowing how many they're going to kill. I mean, I have seen and talked to victims of alcohol-related crashes that have involved up to 16 people. We're talking a lot of bodies and a lot of broken families. We're talking about someone who indiscriminately, after they've had a little bit too much to drink and they're out on the road, is just taking shots at anyone, can kill anyone, can kill 1, 2, 3, or 10.
Innocence and care is no guarantee of safety against the drunk driver. It's the most frightening part of our story. You and I can take all the care in the world, drive carefully, soberly, even defensively, and still at the next corner end up injured or dead. There's no justice here. The drunk driver in a speeding car is a bomb waiting to go off. When it explodes and where and how many innocent people are around is just a matter of luck.
Leave that on. Leave that on, okay? Keep it there, bud. Leave that on. Slide him up.
43-year-old Shelby Davis was one of those at the wrong place at the wrong time, and today she can't even open her own mail. Her left arm is fractured. Her jaw, her pelvis and sternum, every rib in her body is broken. Her teeth were knocked out, her lungs punctured, her bladder damaged, her body bruised and cut all over, all through no fault of her own.
I knew there was going to be a crash, but there was nothing not even time to put on brakes. So then I remember the glass shatter and all this stuff. The next thing I remember is they were cutting me. It knocked me out, but I came to with them cutting me out of the car.
She was pinned in the car. Her lungs were punctured. She was having trouble breathing. And she told me later that while the medics held her head, she kept saying to herself, I'm not going to be able to hang on much longer. I think I'm about to die. This was her punishment, her crime, driving home on Atlanta Road at the wrong time, 4 minutes past 10. precisely the moment a car coming toward her crossed the center line and hit her head-on. The driver was charged with DWI.
It makes me angry that, well, I had worked an 8-hour day, okay? I'm perfectly innocent. I leave in my car, I watch every move I make, I try to be a careful driver, but here I'm coming down this lane and there's no way, no matter who it had been, they'd have gotten the same what I got. So, you know, and it makes me angry that I'm broken all to pieces, just over the fact that the man, for whatever reason, decides to get in his car drunk.
She'll remain in the hospital for at least 3 months. Her jaw has to be rebuilt, all her teeth replaced. She is certain to have permanent scars, and there's a fair chance she'll always walk with a limp. It's hard to estimate how much this accident will cost her, for medical care, physical therapy, dental work, her lost wages, as well as her husband's while he's home taking care of her. And only part of this will be covered by insurance, and none of it by the state of Georgia.
There's something called a victim indemnity fund, and almost every state has a victim indemnity fund. And this fund is set aside for victims of violent crimes. Victims of alcohol-related crashes are only eligible for this fund in about 16 states because we're not considered victims of violent crimes. My daughter was thrown 125 feet. She was so badly mutilated that I could not donate any of her organs so that someone else could live. Now you tell me that's not violent.
The picture of Shelby Davis lying in a hospital bed reminds us of something else. Most of the time when we hear about automobile accidents, we hear only about death. Generally, radio stations and television stations and newspapers only cover those accidents where someone dies. But there's another legacy that the DWI driver leaves behind that too often we forget: the people who survive. The 500,000 people each year who are injured or crippled or maimed.
In your location about 10 minutes. 30-year-old male. Advise Parkland this could be possible amputation at the knee.
Platdale received 717-026. 717, do you have a patient name and incident number for me?
I don't have a name and Dr. Wall.
His name is Vincent Tenhoupen, 22 years old, a plumber's helper from Houston, Texas, working on a job in Dallas. It's midnight, the morning of May 2nd. This is the emergency room at Parkland Hospital.
BK.
First IVF.
Ready? Major orthopedics 3 times in a row. That was before he's on his 3rd bag of ringers. How many lines have you got in?
Tenhoupen is in a lot of pain. His kneecap is crushed. His left leg is nearly severed just below the knee. He was on his way home on a motorcycle when he was struck from behind by a hit-and-run driver who was speeding, weaving, and according to the police, very likely drunk. Police say Tenhoupen is innocent. The accident wasn't his fault, though he admitted to having a few beers.
Hey, how much you have to drink tonight?
You're not making it any better, brother.
4 beers. 4 beers?
4 drafts.
4 draft beers?
The doctors can't find a pulse in his left foot. Except for a few strands of muscle still intact, his left leg has been cut entirely in half, which means in about 2 hours. After they move him to an operating room, Tenhoupen will lose his left leg. For the rest of his life, he will be an amputee. Of course, with 500,000 injured every year, the list of names is endless. But let me give you just one more, a woman, Kit Pardee. There isn't a lot to say, not a lot you probably haven't already figured out. A drunk driver hit her head on. She broke her neck. Except for a few muscles in her arms, she's paralyzed from the neck down. The condition is permanent. But what's not so obvious is her strength, her courage, her will to stay alive.
I was very conscious of my body telling me, just give up. You know, there's not enough left here to work. And I think psychologically is when that kicks in, that will to sort of, you know, I can hang on and hang in, and you do. And even if you have to do that consciously and say it minute by minute over a course of days to where you get a little more stable, you do it. And you're surprised at how hard you'll fight for the next breath of air, for the next, you know, day the sun comes up. You fight very, very hard.
29 years old, a researcher at the Merrill Lynch office in Silver Spring, Maryland. She's able to work every day because with an electric wheelchair, she is mobile. With a stick strapped to each hand, she can turn pages and type. Still, every day is a struggle. There's always some pain, always a reminder that her independence is lost forever. And I wondered if she ever wished her accident had been fatal.
I know for a fact, psychologically, physically, financially, it would be much easier for everybody involved if I'd been killed.
For you?
For me, for everyone. Knowing that I have, you know, probably more than a few years left and we'll suffer psychologically and physically. And I know that that will be part of it. It is hard, but I've never wished that I hadn't survived.
Kit was driving below the speed limit that night, and she had her seatbelt on. The man who hit her had crossed over the center line, and at about 60 miles per hour, according to Kit, he drove into the right front side of her car. He was first charged with reckless driving. The charge was later reduced to failure to stay in his established lane, for which he received a fine of $100. After the accident, Kit never saw the man again. Her wheelchair makes a strange sound. It almost sounds like tears. A cry from artificial legs, a sound you'll never hear from her. This woman doesn't cry or feel sorry for herself, which Kit says is hard for some people to understand.
You know, they're like, Kit, don't you ever, you know, don't you just burn up? Don't you just get eaten up with anger over, you know, what did I do to deserve this? I've seen it. This is what I think is the sorry state of affairs in this country and other places, and what people don't realize. There's nobody that not only deserves it, but no one who is not vulnerable to it. We're all on the roads, and it could happen to anybody, anytime.
A video game, a fast car on a racetrack, a steering wheel, gas pedal, and a brake. The driver is a teenager. And in some ways, for him, this game is not much different than real life. After the collision, the car reappears, the race continues. There's no real damage, no one is hurt, the game begins again. And in the minds of some young people, driving in a video game is the same as driving in real life. There are no consequences, no one really dies. Driving is a game, a source of status and fun. There's no sense in lecturing about injury or death. In the years of immortality, 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, you're too young to die, too young to understand.
They're not going to buy into that. They think that they're the most skilled person in the world.
And they're immortal.
That's right. And nothing's going to hurt them. And death is not frightening at all. So, no, that's not going to work.
Of course, death is frightening, or ought to be, and they do get hurt. The statistics by now are infamous. Car wrecks kill more young people between the ages of 16 and 24 than any other single cause. The life expectancy of every age group in the nation is increasing, except one, kids. Their life expectancy is going down. Alcohol-related accidents is the cause. Proportionately, young drivers kill more people and are killed more often than any other age group in America. They die at the rate of almost one every hour, though not always one at a time.
The car was headed westbound on 80th Avenue when struck by the Burlington Northern train. The impact...
The evening news on Channel 9, October 4th, 1984, in Denver, Colorado. The story of 4 teenagers killed when their car collided with a freight train the night before. 3 of the 4 had been drinking, including the driver, whose blood alcohol level was .08. Not legally drunk, but legally impaired.
The lone female in the car was helicoptered to Denver General Hospital. She died in the operating room, even before authorities could determine her name. Rick Salinger, 9 News.
4 dead, and they leave behind a question. A week after the accident, the medical examiner reported that of the 4 teenagers killed, 1 of them had not been drinking. Why wasn't he behind the wheel that night? Why didn't he take the car keys and insist on driving? And why didn't the others let him? A Of course, kids are not much different than the rest of us. According to one study, most say they can handle a car under the influence of alcohol, and some even argue they're better drivers after they've had a few drinks. Beer drinkers say that more than any other group. Of course, they're wrong. The evidence is overwhelming, as we discovered for ourselves. We gathered 4 volunteers, college students, driving 4 different cars and put them on a road course laid out in a parking lot. One test was to drive off the curb and then get back on the road again. The second was a pylon in the middle of the roadway, forcing them to go either left or right. And finally, there was a short slalom course. For each, the challenge was the same, to stay at about 25 miles per hour and not hit any pylons. All 4 drove the course once to get used to it, and then we opened the bar. 20-year-old Rick Allison drank 7 glasses of whiskey and ginger ale with 1.5 ounces of liquor in each drink. 19-year-old Lauren DeBray had 4 cans of beer. 21-year-old Bernadette Messiah had 4 glasses of wine, 8 ounces each. And Greg Bernal, 23 years old, drank 5 vodkas and orange juice. All the drinks were consumed in slightly more than an hour, after which everyone was given a breathalyzer test to determine their blood alcohol content, or BAC. Everyone tested above 0.05, defined as legally impaired in most states, and 2 of the 4 were above 0.1, which is legally drunk in every state in the Union. And then it was time to drive. The first driver was Greg Bernal, 0.08. Next, Bernadette Messiah, 0.16. The third driver was Lauren DeBray, 0.12. And finally, Rick Allison, 0.07. Everyone failed. Beer or wine, vodka or whiskey, male or female, different body weights, it didn't matter. Even at 20 or 25 miles per hour, everyone flunked. And if these pylons were other cars or people on a real street, especially at night, the result would have been a lot of wrecked cars and injured people, which is precisely what happens every night in real life. They kill others, they kill themselves. An estimated 7,000 under the age of 25 die every year because of drinking and driving. And in 1981, 2 among those 7,000 were good friends, members of the same high school hockey team, and they died within 4 days of each other. Their coach was Bob Anastas, and his life changed on the day of the first boy's funeral as he watched dozens of students walk by the coffin.
Then I saw girls coming in with their white dresses and their red roses, putting them in the coffin, and I watched it. I became very, very angry at this. In fact, I became really angry at this because I kept saying, where were they 2 nights ago? Where were these kids that were crying at the coffin, placing the roses in the coffin? Where were they when they could have walked up to this kid and said, you can't drive. Let me take the keys. I'll drive you home. What's happening here? They're crying after the fact.
He organized a student movement called SAD, Students Against Driving Drunk. And today there are 8,000 chapters in high schools all over America. And for one of those chapters, prom night is only a few weeks away, and they're worried about kids who might be drinking and driving after the prom.
You know, everyone's not going to be drinking, so somebody can have cool enough head to say you can't drive.
People really need to talk it up at prom. You know, when at parties later and everything. You know, say don't drive.
I think the more people that are together at, say, prom, I think that, most people double. They go in groups. They tend to look after one another more than when people just go out, by themselves. And I mean, they say, hey, you've had too much to drink. You shouldn't drive. Why don't we stay here? Why don't you let me drive? I haven't been drinking.
Prom night, a beautiful night in the spring of the year, but there is some danger here. After the prom, it seems likely there will be parties with liquor and beer, and for some kids before morning, a question will arise. If you drink tonight, how will you get to the next party, and how will you get home? Bob Anastas says the SAD members here have one advantage at least. They've already thought about that question the day they signed the SAD contract with their parents.
It's a piece of paper. Legally, it couldn't hold up any place. But it's my word and your word. And the word is going to be, as a teenager, I agree to call you for safe, sober transportation home. If I'm ever in a situation where I've been drinking or a friend of mine has been drinking, and you agree to come and get me. The parents are going to agree they will not hassle you at that time. They will put you to bed. They will talk about it the next day.
But the contract is controversial, and some groups, like the National Federation of Parents for Drug-Free Youth, argue that there is a subtle message contained in the SAD contract, a message that says to kids, it's okay to drink as long as you don't drink and drive.
Well, the contract really just doesn't go far enough. The major problem is that it really should say, I won't drink and I won't take drugs to have a good time. Instead, it more or less gives permission. I can drink, but I just won't get behind the wheel. It also supposes that a young person will have that judgment to put the dime in the phone and make the phone call to call mom and dad when he's intoxicated, and that can be a real problem as well. I think that we need to recognize that more and more young people all the time are getting involved in drug-free parties, drug-free organizations, and are taking on a way of life that says, I don't need to be intoxicated to have a good time.
Dr. Voth makes a point. The surest way to keep kids from drinking and driving and dying is to convince them not to drink at all. The National Transportation Safety Board says out of every 2,000 drunk drivers on the road any given night, only one is pulled over.
And we found that the police, half the time, fail to detect a drunk driver, somebody who's above the .10, half the time they let him go.
Why?
Because they simply cannot tell, based on just the overt signs, whether someone is over the legal limit, the .10 number. You know, if someone is an experienced drunk driver, the Alcoholics Problem Drinkers, they're very good at summoning their faculties and fooling a cop into thinking that they're not really impaired. It's quite easy. In fact, there's been studies that have showed that physicians half the time will miss an intoxicated person. And so the police are no different. In fact, they're probably as expert as anybody in our society detecting drunks, yet they're wrong half the time, or they fail to detect them.
And if they are detected and then arrested, what happens to them? The safety board says in most jurisdictions there's at least a 50-50 chance that the drunk driver will receive a probated sentence, perhaps a small fine, and will be back on the highway the next day. Lee Albert Ennist, for example. He has been arrested and convicted of drunk driving 5 times since 1971. 4 of those convictions have come in the last 4 years. And for these 5 crimes, what was his punishment?
Actually, I spent, as far as the court has given me in jail, I spent 1 day in jail. And, but the court has always given me at least 30 days each time, or either that.
In a treatment center?
Yes. I've gone to 5 different treatment centers.
And 1 day in jail?
Yes.
The last time, he killed someone. November 27, 1984, Ennist was in the White Mercury on 75th Street in Seattle, Washington. A police car was behind him, lights flashing, trying to pull him over. Ennist's blood alcohol level was .19. He stepped on the gas, ran a stop sign, and hit 33-year-old Paul Runholm, driving the green Mercury Comet. Runholm was rushed to Harborview Medical Center. His wife was called, and then she went to the hospital.
I was probably there 15 minutes or so, and the doctor came in and basically said that Paul didn't make it. They'd done everything that they could, but he had massive injuries, and he died.
It's hard to be objective here. By all accounts, this was an extraordinary man. Most of his career he spent helping retarded people. He was big and tall and strong, a master carpenter, a fisherman, a sailor. He liked to sing and laugh and play music. He had dozens of friends. One of them, a proud woman who wouldn't quite say it, but I think misses him desperately.
You know, I get up, I go to work, I do the things that I've always done. I'm real fortunate to have a lot of friends, a lot of supports there. A job that I like a lot. It's at 5 o'clock. I'm not sure what to do. Paul and I were very good friends. We did a lot of things together. And I miss that a lot.
Ennis was convicted of vehicular homicide and sentenced to 31 months in prison. He told me that someday he hopes to gather enough courage to speak to Joyce Runholm, and I wondered what he would say.
I mean, I didn't deliberately mean to take his life. And actually, anybody who takes somebody's life, you know you would exchange it for, if there was a way I could do it, certainly I would. I really would, even though I have children.
Well, if you meant it from the standpoint of him being dead instead of Paul, I'd buy that. I mean, not that I wish him being dead, but I want, you know, I want Paul here.
The story of Lee Ennis is not all that unusual. He was convicted 5 times for DWI, yet only spent 1 day in jail. 5 times he was sent to alcohol school. Each time he got drunk and drove again. In the end, he had to kill someone before being sent to prison. In a year and 8 months, it's likely he'll be released on parole. The question is, of course, is this justice? The man who crippled Kit Pardee paid a $100 fine and was driving the next day. In the crash that killed Robert Bell's wife and child, Dave McManus was driving without a license or registration. He had no insurance. He had a previous DWI conviction. One answer comes from MAD. They argue our treatment of drunk drivers in this country is inconsistent, unjust, and unfair to the victims.
We don't have anybody in court representing us now. The district attorney represents the state, not us. And as far as I'm concerned, in many cases represents the criminal when they're agreeable to plea bargaining. A public defender is there to represent the criminal, or he can pay for a private defense attorney. The judge represents the criminal, as far as I'm concerned, by the leniency given in many of these particular cases. And the jury, in many cases, I feel, represents the criminal when they come from that attitude of there, but for the grace of God go I drink and drive, I'm not a criminal, therefore this individual isn't. But there is absolutely no one there who is working to protect the public, the innocent public, who is going to be jeopardized if this individual is back out on the road again, and nobody there to fight for me or to fight for my child who is dead.
In 1983, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration studied a series of fatal accidents in which the drunk driver lived, but someone else died. In that study, they found half of the drunk drivers were not charged with DWI. 15% of them were later released without any charge, and only 5% were charged with manslaughter or vehicular homicide. For much of this, the Safety Board blames American judges.
They are simply not using the authority that legislatures have given them. And that's why I think we're seeing the movements now to have mandatory minimum penalties to try to restrain the latitude that judges have in fashioning sentences.
They're too soft.
I think many of them are.
On the subject of justice, one more story that may alarm those who own a restaurant or bar. Jeremiah Silva was 5 years old when the accident happened. Now he's 7. His brother Andrew was only a year old. Today he's 3. Together the boys are worth $3.9 million. That's what they'll be paid during the course of their lives for the loss of their mother. Of course, at this point, neither child understands very much about money, and the older boy especially doesn't understand why his mother died.
Even to this day, you know, he'll say, why my mommy? Why did my mommy have to die? Which is a normal question, I think, for, you know, most any child. But the sad part is that they'll never really know her. You know, I mean, they'll never know how wonderful she was, how sweet she was, and she was.
Susan Johansson Silva was 24 years old when she died, March 11th, 1983. She was riding in this white Chevette when she was hit by a drunk driver on Route 6 in Massachusetts, just west of Cape Cod. 45 minutes before the accident, the man was drinking at the Cathay Temple restaurant and bar. According to a witness, when he first walked into the restaurant, he was already drunk. But they served him anyway, and then he walked out, got into his car. A mile later, he killed Susan Silva. Her family sued the restaurant and the drunk driver. His insurance company paid $80,000. The restaurant's insurance company will pay almost $4 million.
Yes, I think that's a fair settlement. How do you pay for somebody's life anyway? How do you give them back their mother? You never can. At least now, maybe, they will never have to you know, want for, well, some things anyway. Material things, but they'll never have Susan.
Massachusetts is one of 38 states in this country that has what's called a dram shop law. Simply put, the law says that if you serve a drink to an intoxicated customer, you're responsible for whatever damage he does. Of course, in some cases, it's hard to estimate the damage.
On your mark. Get set. Go! Go, 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 go! Woo! All right! 7 seconds here.
A beer chugging contest in Fort Lauderdale. The idea to throw down 12 ounces of beer faster than anyone else and win a prize. It's a curious contest. Some might say harmless. Others might ask, why does drinking alcohol as fast as you can deserve a reward? And secondly, what's it going to be like in Lauderdale tonight when all these people get in their cars?
The point is, we still don't take alcohol all that seriously in this country. For a good many people, getting drunk is no big deal, which means, among other things, according to the National Safety Council, on the roads of America this weekend, there will be several million drunk drivers, which in turn means that some of you watching this program right now won't live through the weekends. The question that remains, of course, is what should we do about this? And from all the people I've interviewed in the last 6 months, I've heard a number of suggestions.
First, police need more help. In cities with DWI task forces, in many cases, drunk driving arrests have gone up, alcohol-related accidents have gone down. But because of money and manpower, many jurisdictions either can't afford a DWI task force or can't afford to continue one. Our justice system also needs more help. Both prosecutors and courts need additional staff to help process the volume of DWI cases. Some counties, for example, have hired assistant DAs who do nothing but drunk driving cases, and their salaries are paid for by the fines against convicted drivers. Additionally, MAD and other groups argue that we need stiffer penalties against drunk drivers and that judges need to be convinced to use the full force of the law. About young people, the advice was unanimous. Kids should hear from all those around them, parents, teachers, counselors, each other. Don't drink and drive. If you do get drunk, give the keys to a friend. If the driver is drunk, don't get in the car, which is good advice for all of us. Finally, there was one other idea for you and for me.
If we would report in the press, in the media, every week, like we did with the war in Vietnam. Last week, on the nation's highways, 250 people died in alcohol-related accidents. How many weeks would it take? How many months? How many years before the public would say, we're ready, we've had it? Can you imagine an Air Florida type accident every day? How long would it take before the world would come to an end from all the pressure that was put on by the Congress, by the public? I mean, it would be unbelievable. The country would never have seen that kind of pressure before to do something.
Perhaps the last point to remember is also the simplest. Drinking and driving means death. In the emergency room at a Dallas hospital, a 25-year-old woman has just died. One of the 24,000 killed this year by drunk drivers.
Got an ambulance effort on board.
Blown both sides.
Both pupils are blown.
That's all.
I suppose if I had the power to convince anybody of anything, I guess it would be just to look at yourselves and to look at your family and to realize how precious life is and how easily it can end.